Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is July 29th, 2019, and this is podcast number 32. I am glad to have you back with us for another season. It's been a long break, but we are back. So the podcast today, we're going to be talking about education. Education is a very complex issue. So many philosophers, so many thinkers have talked about education in one way or another. But today we're going to be examining the concept of education from a much more terra standpoint, from a trivial standpoint. But still, we're all going to focus on the concept from a philosophical lens, and most likely from an ontological lens, where the individual is the center of our analysis. The question becomes, why education? Why do we go to school? What are the benefits of education for the individual? Not necessarily for the collective, but for the entity that is forced to be within an educational setting. So we have to look at education as a mechanism, but a mechanism that is not necessarily in the interest of the individual. We're going to be looking at, how or why education is structured the way it is structured. So our discussion is going to center, for the most part, on the individual in terms of why the entity or the person has to be educated. And once the person is educated, what could the person do with that education? So these are some of the issues that we're going to discuss in this series. But for today, we're going to be talking about the purpose of education. We're going to give you a brief overview of what that purpose is or what that purpose might be. As usual, without further ado, let us delve right into it. What is the purpose of education? Now, this is a very interesting question to ask, at least from a philosophical standpoint. The question as to what is the purpose of education is a question that has been in the psyche of so many thinkers for centuries. And one of the most famous philosophers that comes to mind is John Dewey, where he is trying to decipher the meaning of education. He's asking certain questions as to why do we go to school? In this podcast today, I am going to talk about education within a similar framework. In other words, I am going to talk about education speculatively, in terms of trying to understand the context from a philosophical standpoint. Now let's go back to the original question, that is, what is the purpose of education? Why does one go to school? And when one goes to school, what one is supposed to accomplish there? Okay. Now, if you're looking at the concept of education, the premise of this concept is that the individual is at a brute stage, savage stage, if you will. And that is to echo Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And the individual needs to be refined, fine-tuned, in order to perform in society. Of course, we could go back and try to understand whether or not the individual makes society or society makes the individual. But this is for another discussion. For today, let us focus on the concept of education itself. When we are talking about education, the underlying principle, at least the underlying premise here, is that there is an individual who finds himself at a savage stage, at a brute stage. And there ought to be a mechanism which allows the individual to transcend that stage. And that mechanism is education. And in education, the individual is taught how to be, when to be, where to be, and what to do when the individual is wherever he was supposed to be. In other words, ever since you were a kid or child, you were taken to a place where you were taught how to be. And that how to be usually, generally involves learning how to speak, how to walk, how to talk, okay? How to behave. In the process, the individual is taught certain skills. For example, if you're learning how to speak, you might learn how to talk or to become a public speaker, which in this case becomes a skill which you were taught at a particular place. If you went there to learn how to eat properly, in the process you might learn how to cook, how to perform things related to food. Now, these are trivial examples, I admit, but the point here is that when you go to school, you go somewhere where you learn how to be a certain way. And usually that information could be transformed into skills. Of course, there are nuances as to specific skills, general skills, and whatnot. But we're not going to focus on that for now. But what we're talking about here is that when you go to school, at least that is the presumption, the underlying premise of education, is you go there for that. But there is a problem. If going to school is to learn certain skills, the question becomes, why do I have to go to school to learn those skills? Would I still be able to learn those skills or develop them on my own? And when I go to school and I learn those skills and I am not able to use them the proper way, was my education a failure? Okay? Who's to blame for that failure? Should I be held responsible for my failure? Or should the teacher or the teachers or the school itself or the educational system as a whole be held responsible for my failure? Well, these are some of the questions that, like I said in the beginning of this podcast, that have been asked by so many thinkers, and they've asked them in different ways. But the common understanding is that we ought to have a clear consensus as to what is education, why we go to school, and what do we do with an education. Now, society is not that linear because, see, the way education is described is that there's a process by which you begin at a certain point and then you end at a certain point. And the process by which you go from one point to another is the process of education itself. This linear approach to education is erroneous because education does not necessarily entail the induction into a process. Okay? There is more to education than going from a point to another. What that might be, then, you might ask. Well, education, to go back to the concept of enlightenment, to the concept of coming out of the darkness into the light, coming from being a savage and into a civilized entity, I think there's a little bit of truth to all of that. Okay? Education does not have to be a means to an end or an end to a means. Okay? Education should not be a process. Rather, education should be an activity. Education should be a discovery. It should be a discovery of things, including the self, others, and entities that evolve in that environment. Let's go back to the concept of tabula rasa. The idea that the being at birth does not have anything. The mind is blank. It's a blank slate. Okay? Now, if we were to go with this understanding, that at birth the individual has absolutely no knowledge of. Okay? Education would become this discovery. Now, that education does not have to be a formal process. In fact, if we were to look at education from this angle, we would see that education starts the minute the being is born. The minute you have a living being, that living entity is learning about the world. The learning itself allows the being to discover the world. As the being discovers the world, he discovers himself. In the process of discovering both the self and the world, the being is being educated, not only about the self, but also about the world. So let us say that you're a baby and you don't know about certain things. You don't even know that they exist. You can either learn them by experiencing those things yourself, or you could learn them vicariously. In this case, you learn through somebody else. Sometimes you learn through your parents. You learn through your siblings, or you learn by watching others, or you learn by experiencing it. In one of my podcasts, I talked about the notion of touching the fire. When the baby touches the fire, he learns right at this moment. And one of the podcasts I was talking about right and wrong, where I sort of described the concept of right and wrong in terms of how you experience the reality or the stimuli that are around you. And that experience in turn informs your understanding of what is righteous and what is not, because sometimes as you experience a reality, you get to find out whether that reality is pleasurable to you physically, mentally, or not. And if that reality were to be pleasurable to you to a point, you might consider that reality as something pleasurable, thereby something good. The same philosophy applies within the context of education itself. In fact, education is the foundation of the concept itself. What happens is that as you learn, as you discover the world, you learn about the world. And as you learn about the world, you learn about yourself in the world. And that's why education in and of itself should not be a linear process where you go from one point to another, because you learn everywhere, you learn from everything, from everyone, you learn by simply being. So now the question becomes, from a practical standpoint, what is the purpose of education? Education has only one purpose, at least at the way it is structured in society today. It is control. Education, of course, again, before I go further in this analysis, when I speak about control, I'm not talking about a conspiracy somewhere. It is not a conspiracy, okay? When I speak about control, I am speaking about the foundation of society itself, which is the individual has to be under control. That's the whole point of society. Society is there to instill order in a world of chaos, right? So if society is there to instill order, the individual could not be allowed to be himself, could not be allowed to be however he wants to be. And education, and to take it to the concept of being a savage, when the individual is the way he was supposed to be as per his nature, the individual is not civilized, because the individual is at a state of bestiality. He's a savage. He reacts to his natural instincts. He does things however his impulses tell him to do them. So he does not take into account he is not inhibited, to put it this way. Education is supposed to teach the individual to be a certain way. Thereby, education is supposed to allow the individual to inhibit himself. And when he does not inhibit himself, there are other entities within society that are going to inhibit him. Therefore, education by itself is control. The individual is being taught at an early age to be a certain way. And that way is according to the way education is defined within that environment. If education is defined environment as you ought to be this kind of citizen or that kind of citizen, then you are either going to inhibit yourself in terms of your nature, or you're going to allow yourself to be inhibited by some X or Y entity within that environment. So education, at least as the way it is described today, is this idea that the individual has to be put under control. So the individual is being taught how to be since an early age, so that the individual can never be as his nature designed him to be. So right off the bat, education is control. The individual is being taught to be a certain way. Okay? There's nothing in that benefits the individual as a whole, because what happens is that the individual is being turned into a robot. The individual is taught to be, not necessarily, the individual does not discover himself in society. The individual already knows who he is, because he can only refer to whoever was there before him. There are examples, there are models of entities that were a certain way. And you're supposed to be that way, aspire to be this way. For example, you're supposed to become a doctor, you're supposed to become a lawyer, you're supposed to become an engineer of whatnot, okay? Those are models put right before your eyes, and you were being taught ever since you were born to be that way, okay? I might not be interested in becoming a lawyer. I might not be interested in becoming a doctor or an engineer, a musician or whatnot. But in a society where education is defined according to control, the individual ought to have a title. The individual ought to have a specific task where the individual is aspired to become. Okay? If you are growing up in a society, especially in most modern civilizations, where tasks are, sort of assigned to you at an early age, where wherever you were born is going to determine whoever you are going to become. Okay? So that individual at birth is designed to be a certain way. But as soon as he is born into a society, in that environment, the individual is going to be according to the will of that environment. So the individual is going to become that robot, that entity that is according to somebody else's understanding of who he is or who he is supposed to be. So in that sense, education, if we are to look at it from a philosophical standpoint, is control. Okay? It is the idea that you ought to be restrained. You ought to be limited in who you are and how you could be and when and where you could be. So if we're talking about education from a philosophical standpoint, the key word here is control.